It feels like in almost any political chat these days, you hear progressive and socialist just thrown around a
All the
lot.
time and often, like interchangeably, right? As if they're just different words for the same thing.
Exactly. But is that actually right? Is progressive just, I don't know, a nicer way to say socialist? That's what we're really digging into today.
Yeah, absolutely. Our mission for this deep dive is, well, to cut through some of that noise. We want to clarify the definitions, look at the history, how these ideas work in practice.
And really pinpoint the differences, the nuances, to help you figure out if progressive ideas are basically socialist principles just rebranded.
We've been looking at, analyses of the ideologies themselves, specific historical examples, and of course, debates about certain policies.
And look, if you've ever felt a bit lost in all the political jargon, you are definitely not alone. We're aiming to bring some real clarity today, maybe even a few aha moments.
Okay, so let's dive right in. Definitions first. What exactly do we mean when we say progressive?
Okay, progressivism. Fundamentally, it's this belief that society can and should get better. It pushes for reforms, social, economic, environmental. But here's the real kicker.
It operates within the framework of capitalism. That's crucial, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's about fixing the problems in the system, tackling inequality, maybe exploitation, environmental damage, using government intervention, things like regulations, welfare programs.
So the goal is improving well-being, making things fairer, but without tossing out private enterprise or individual freedoms entirely. It wants to correct capitalism's flaws.
Right. Think of it like tuning up the engine, not replacing the whole car.
Exactly. Now, socialism, that's a different beast altogether. It's a broader economic and political system. The core idea is collective or state ownership of the means of production.
So things like factories, land, major resources.
Precisely. The aim is usually a much more radical redistribution of wealth and power, often through things like nationalizing industries or, significant wealth transfer.
It sounds much more fundamental.
It is. Now, of course, there's democratic socialism, which works within democratic structures, but the central theme is transforming the basic economic structure, not just reforming it. Marx and Engels, for instance, envisioned a classless society that's a revolutionary goal compared to progressivism's more incremental changes.
So simply put, progressivism tweaks capitalism. Socialism wants to replace it.
That's the core distinction.
Okay, but why are they so often confused then, if the difference is that fundamental?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to overlap in some of the goals. Both often want to reduce inequality, improve public welfare, right?
Sure, you hear that from both sides.
And that means sometimes the policy proposals can sound similar, universal health care, for example, but the methods, and especially the ultimate end game, they're worlds apart.
And getting them mixed up really muddies the water in public debates, doesn't it?
Hugely. It distorts how we understand policies and their potential outcomes. Mislabeling becomes a political tool.
Okay, so let's unpack the history then. Where did progressivism come from?
Progressivism really gained steam late 19th, early 20th century. The big one is the progressive era in the U.S., say the 1890s to the 1920s.
Right, figures like Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson.
Exactly. They were pushing reforms to tackle problems that came with industrial capitalism. Think curbing monopoly power with antitrust laws.
Improving safety with things like the Pure Food and Drug Act.
Expanding democracy with women's suffrage. All these aim to make capitalism fairer, more stable, and ultimately to strengthen it by addressing its flaws. That was the key preservation through reform.
And the New Deal seems like a massive example of that, FDR in the 30s.
Absolutely pivotal. Facing the Great Depression, the New Deal brought in huge progressive policies. Social Security, unemployment insurance, massive public works projects.
Things we still have today.
Exactly. And the crucial point is, these were designed to stabilize the capitalist economy and ease suffering within that system. They weren't about seizing industries or ending private property.
Even though some critics back then called it socialist.
Oh, absolutely. That label was thrown around then, too. But the underlying goal was preserving the system, making it work better in a crisis. That's a progressive hallmark.
So progressivism arose to manage capitalism's problems from within. What about socialism's origins? Deeper roots.
But much deeper, really going back to 19th century Europe. Thinkers like Marx and Engels reacting to the Industrial Revolution, advocating for worker control over production.
And then the Russian Revolution in 1917.
A massive turning point. The Bolsheviks actually implemented a state-controlled system, nationalizing industries, collectivizing farms. Now, that Soviet model became heavily associated with authoritarianism, which is a really important historical note.
But that's not the only form of socialism.
No, definitely not. You have democratic socialism, like we see variations of in Scandinavia, which tries to blend market economies with very strong welfare states and worker protections. So, socialism itself is a spectrum.
Okay, so the key historical split remains. Progressivism reforms capitalism from within, while socialism, in its various forms, seeks a more fundamental systemic change, often involving ownership.
Precisely. And that overlap, especially around welfare policies, is where so much of the modern confusion comes from.
Right, which brings us nicely to specific policies, things like universal health care, wealth taxes, free college. These are often the battlegrounds where the terms get blurry.
They really are. Let's take universal health care.
Yeah, constantly labeled socialist, especially any talk of Medicare for all in the US.
And that label usually sticks because it involves significant government action,
Right.
funding, regulations.
Seems like the main trigger.
But the typical progressive argument for it is about guaranteeing access to care for everyone, usually within a mixed economy. It doesn't automatically mean the government owns all the hospitals or hires all the doctors.
Like in the UK with the NHS. It's tax-funded, free at the point of use, but there are still private options alongside it.
Exactly. That's a classic progressive achievement. It reforms the healthcare market to ensure universal access. Contrast that with, say, Cuba, where the state owns and runs basically the entire healthcare system. That's a socialist model, replacing the market, not just reforming access within it.
Okay, that distinction in scope reform versus replacement seems key. What about wealth taxes? Taxing the super rich.
Another flashpoint. Critics immediately jump to socialism, arguing it punishes success, it's radical
Yeah,
redistribution.
it'll kill investment, all that.
But from a progressive standpoint, a wealth tax is usually framed as a tool to, well, curb extreme wealth concentration.
Yeah.
The idea is that too much wealth at the very top can destabilize capitalism and society.
So it's about making the system itself fairer and more stable.
Exactly. It operates within capitalism. It aims to generate revenue for public services and reduce inequality, not abolish private property altogether. Think about France's old wealth tax that raised money, aimed at inequality, but didn't dismantle French capitalism.
Okay, so that's different from, say, Venezuela nationalizing its oil industry.
Totally different. Nationalization like that is a socialist policy transferring entire industries from private to state control. That's about changing the ownership structure, not just taxing wealth within the existing structure.
Makes sense. And free college tuition, same dynamic.
Pretty much. Progressives argue it's an investment in people, reduces debt, boosts social mobility, all good things for a healthy capitalist economy in the long run.
While critics call it socialist, saying it's a huge burden on taxpayers, might devalue degrees.
Right. But look at countries like Germany or Norway. They have tuition-free higher education, funded by taxes, but it operates squarely within their capitalist economies.
The state isn't taking over the universities or dictating everything.
No, it's a social welfare policy, a progressive one, designed to enhance opportunity. It's not about the state seizing control of educational institutions in a way a more centrally planned socialist system might envision.
So across these examples, healthcare, taxes, education, the pattern holds. Progressivism aims to make capitalism fairer and more inclusive, while socialism focuses on shifting ownership and control towards the collective or the state.
That's the core takeaway, which leads us perfectly to the Scandinavian model.
Ah, yes. The Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, always brought up in these debates, often by both sides.
Exactly, because they have characteristics that appeal to both viewpoints. Very high taxes, incredibly generous welfare systems, healthcare, education, childcare are top-notch strong unions and worker protections.
But also really successful, innovative market economies. So the big question, are they socialist utopias or are they progressive success stories?
Well, the leaders of those countries are pretty clear. Remember the Danish prime minister saying Denmark is a market economy, explicitly not socialist.
I do remember that making headlines.
These systems rely heavily on private enterprise. Think IKEA, Volvo from Sweden, Novo Nordisk from Denmark. These are global capitalist companies.
So they're not state-owned.
Nope. What they do is tax heavily. Sometimes up to 50% of GDP goes through the state to fund those extensive welfare programs. But the engine of wealth creation remains largely private industry. Ownership isn't collectivized.
That seems like the defining factor again. Ownership.
Absolutely. A socialist model would imply state or collective ownership of those major industries. In fact, Sweden did experiment a bit with partial nationalization back in the 70s.
How did that go?
Didn't work out too well. They faced efficiency problems and largely rolled it back. It actually reinforces the idea that their success lies in this progressive balancing act, using the wealth generated by capitalism to fund social equity, not in dismantling capitalism itself.
So the Nordic model is really exhibit A for progressive reform working within capitalism, not an example of socialism.
Pretty much nails it. It debunks the simplistic idea that any robust welfare state must be socialist.
Okay, so we have these core distinctions. But you mentioned a gray area. Where do the lines sometimes blur?
Right, it's not always perfectly black and white. There's definitely a spectrum. Some ambitious progressive policies can start to, let's say, touch on principles that also resonate with socialist thought.
Like what, for instance?
We'll take a single-payer healthcare system, like the Medicare for All proposals in the U.S. While the aim is progressive universal access, cost control the mechanism, a highly centralized government-run system could arguably move closer towards a socialist model of implementation, depending on the specifics. It centralizes control significantly.
Okay, so the degree of state control matters.
It does. Or think about the growing progressive interest in things like worker cooperatives or pushing for much greater employee ownership stakes in companies.
Right, giving workers more control or ownership.
That definitely echoes socialist ideas about collective ownership and worker control, even if it's proposed within a market framework, usually on a smaller scale than full nationalization. The key is always the scope and intent reform or transformation.
And the U.S. context makes this even trickier, doesn't it? That socialist label is so loaded here.
Hugely loaded because of the Cold War, the Red Scare, the association of socialism with authoritarian regimes. The word itself carries immense negative baggage in American politics.
So almost any significant government program gets tagged with it.
Pretty much. Look at the Affordable Care Act, the ACA or Obamacare. It was relentlessly attacked as socialist, even though it's fundamentally a market-based system using private insurance companies, subsidies, and regulations. It shows how easily the label gets weaponized to shut down debate.
It also seems like both progressives and socialists often critique similar things about modern capitalism.
That's a really important point. They often share critiques of capitalism's downsides, like soaring inequality, wage stagnation, corporate power, environmental damage.
That shared critique must lead to some overlap in solutions, right?
It can, absolutely. That's where you might see cross-pollination. Think about universal basic income experiments. A progressive might see UBI as a crucial safety net enhancement within capitalism. A socialist might see it as a potential step towards decommodifying labor and ensuring basic needs outside the market a more fundamental shift.
So the motivation and the end goal might still differ even if the policy proposal looks similar on the surface.
Exactly. Acknowledging this gray area, this overlapping critiques and sometimes policies, is vital for having a more nuanced discussion and avoiding those simplistic, often inaccurate labels.
Okay, so we've defined the terms, looked at history, policy, the gray areas. Why does making this distinction actually matter? Is it just semantics?
Oh, it's far more than semantics. Getting the distinction right is crucial for actually shaping policy effectively, for how we govern ourselves. It's not just an academic exercise.
How so?
Well, think about it. If you constantly mislabel practical progressive reforms like expanding healthcare access or investing in green energy as socialism, you can easily scare voters away. You frame sensible ideas as radical threats.
Right, it poisons the well for certain policies.
Exactly. And conversely, if you blur the lines too much the other way, conflating socialism's call for fundamental change with mere progressive tinkering, you might dilute the message for those who genuinely believe a deeper transformation is needed.
So it cuts both ways, hindering clear debate.
Absolutely. It muddies discussions on critical issues, inequality, climate change, healthcare, making it harder to find common ground or even agree on what problem we're trying to solve and what tools are appropriate.
It also seems to reflect fundamentally different views on what government should even do.
That's a core point. Progressivism generally sees government as a referee. Its job is to regulate capitalism, ensure fair play, maybe smooth out the rough edges with safety nets, keep the game going, but make it fairer.
Okay, the referee analogy works. What about socialism?
Socialism often envisions a much more active, directive role for the government, maybe even owning key parts of the economy. More like a coach, maybe even the team owner, actively directing things towards collective goals, not just enforcing rules on private players.
Referee versus coach, that's a helpful way to think about it.
And those different views naturally lead to different priorities. Progressives might focus on minimum wage hikes, tax credits, stronger environmental regulations working within the market system. Socialists might prioritize nationalizing utilities, expanding public ownership, fundamentally restructuring economic power.
So understanding the difference helps us choose the right tool for the job we want done.
Precisely. If your goal is to reduce poverty within a market economy, progressive tools might be appropriate. If you believe the market economy itself is the root problem, you'd look towards socialist solutions. Clarity matters for outcomes.
To make this less abstract, let's bring in some real voices. How does this play out for everyday people?
Yeah, grounding it is important. I chatted with Sarah, who runs a small business in Ohio. She said she supports some progressive ideas, like paid family leave. She sees the benefit for her employees and maybe her business.
Okay, so she's open to some reforms.
Right. But she was very wary of the word socialism. She worried about too much government interference, higher taxes, potentially hurting her business, maybe impacting the broader economy negatively. She wants capitalism, just, fairer. Reform, not transformation.
That sounds like a common perspective. Did you speak to someone with a different view?
I did. Miguel, a community organizer out in California, he actually identifies as a democratic socialist. He looked at the Nordic countries for inspiration on welfare, but he's deeply frustrated by the inequities he sees in the U.S.
So he's looking for bigger changes.
Yeah, he's much more favorable towards ideas like universal basic income, maybe even exploring things like public options for banking. He feels the current system is fundamentally flawed and needs more systemic change, not just tweaks.
Wow, so those two voices really capture the heart of the debate, don't they? Sarah valuing capitalism but wanting fairness. Miguel seeing capitalism itself as needing a fundamental rethink.
Exactly. And for both of them, having clarity on what progressive and socialist actually mean helps shape their political views and choices. The stakes are real.
Okay, let's try to wrap this up then. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. And the main point to keep coming back to is that progressive is not just a synonym for socialist, despite the confusion and the overlap.
Right. The core difference is that relationship to capitalism. Progressivism works to affirm and improve it from within.
While socialism seeks to transform or replace it with a system based more on collective ownership and usually more significant redistribution.
And specific policies like universal health care or wealth taxes, while sometimes sounding socialist due to government involvement, are often framed progressively, aiming to enhance fairness or stability within the market, not get rid of it.
Exactly. The Nordic model, the New Deal. These are powerful examples of the progressive path, distinct from state socialism.
But we also need to acknowledge that gray area, where really ambitious progressive policies might start to borrow ideas or mechanisms that feel closer to socialist principles. Context, intent, and scope are vital there.
Absolutely. Is the policy strengthening and stabilizing, or is it aiming to fundamentally reimagine ownership and control? That's the key question.
So for anyone listening and trying to navigate these debates, what are the key takeaways? How can you approach this with more clarity?
Well, first, define the terms. Understand progressivism's reformist roots and socialism's potentially transformative goals. Second, look closely at the actual policies. Does it regulate or does it take ownership? Does it reform the market or replace it?
Okay, definitions, then policy analysis. What else?
Consider the context. Especially in the U.S., know that socialism is often used as a loaded term, so book critical of how labels are applied. Engage with the nuance, avoid simple binaries. Acknowledge overlap without just equating the two.
And finally,
Listen to diverse voices like Sarah and Miguel. Understand how these ideas impact different people and communities.
great advice. So, the big picture. Progressivism and socialism might share some critiques and even some surface-level goals, but their fundamental visions for society, their methods, and their relationship with capitalism are distinct. Progressivism wants to make capitalism work better for more people.
That's the essence of it, which leads us to a final thought for you, the listener. Where do you draw the line between progressive reform and socialist transformation? It's worth pondering.
Yeah, definitely something to think about. Share your thoughts in the comments if you like. We genuinely love to hear your take on this.
And if you found this discussion helpful, you might want to check out our previous deep dive comparing liberalism and conservatism. It provides some useful context for thinking about different political frameworks.
Great suggestion. Let's keep unraveling the ideas shaping our world.